I am in the office of Dada Saheb Phalke award-winning filmmaker Shyam Benegal, who will tell us how he began his career as an artist before going on to become one of India's greatest filmmakers. What was the art scene in Mumbai like when you first arrived here in the 50s from Hyderabad?
Well, I came here to Bombay in 1958 actually to look for a job, and I found a job in advertising at that time. And my interest, of course, was cinema. It wasn't anything else. But then you see that it wasn't so easy to become a filmmaker. I had a cousin of mine called Gurudat, who was already a filmmaker and a very successful filmmaker at that time. But you see, I came here actually hoping to be able to work with him. But it didn't happen that way. Because he had far too many assistants working with him, and I felt that I really had no place there. But since I wanted to be a filmmaker, and of course not necessarily the kind of filmmaker that Gurudat was, because I had my own ideas about what a film should have and what kind of stories I would like to tell and so on and so forth. So, but he was a source of inspiration. There was no question about it. If it wasn't for him, I think I may have been doing something else. But because he was a successful filmmaker in Bombay and I was in Hyderabad, and my ambition always was to be a filmmaker, and here was somebody who was related to me, who was a successful filmmaker, obviously was going to be a source of inspiration. Well, you know, when I was actually very, very young, I had just joined school, I think, at that time. And about that time, for the very first time, Uday Shankar's troupe had come to Hyderabad, and they were performing. He had so many different ballets he used to do. And so there were 3 performances in a cinema, theatre which became a cinema, called Zamarud Mahal in Hyderabad. And so my father took the entire family to see these 3 different shows of Uday Shankar's. Now, Uday Shankar used to have 2 people. One was, of course, Gurudat was there. He was very young. He was just a boy, and he had just come out of Uday Shankar's own dance school, and he was performing in that particular. He had some role in that, and then of course there was the music director of Uday Shankar's was a person called Vishnudas Shirali. Now Shirali, as you know, was a Ramchi like me. So, you know, he was somebody that was introduced to us by my uncle in Calcutta, who used to do all the publicity work for Uday Shankar shows. He knew them well, they knew each other well and so on and so forth. So, Vishnudas Shirali was a person who had given these tickets to my father to come and see these shows. So he had taken the whole family to see these shows, which we did. And that's when I saw Uday Shankar Gurudat dance for the first time. And later, of course, before the troupe went away from Hyderabad, he came home for dinner or something like that. And then my father asked him, would he like to do a little dance? So which he did. You know, he performed that particular evening. So it was just quite extraordinary. It's amazing that I should be thinking about this 65 years after it happened.
Right.
You know, I mean, I hadn't thought of it. Right. I remember we were sitting around, and then then there was this little music that was played, and then Gudar did his different dances that he used to do, a peacock dance and something else, and so all of them, the choreography was that of Uday Shankar's.
You spent your early days in Bombay, arriving from Hyderabad, engrossed in painting. Is that true? You started as a painter?
Well, I was never, painting was never it wasn't something that I planned out as a vocation. It was an avocation. Because you see, the person who was a painter, my eldest brother was a painter, my uncle who lived in Calcutta was a painter. In fact, he had a commercial art studio there, which was very successful. And my eldest brother was a painter. And there was painting in the family, let me put it that way. Because my father was a pretty good draftsman. His drawings were outstanding. So although he was a photographer by profession, but he had a very good hand. Now, so having come from a family like that, there was a natural inclination towards wanting to do a little bit of painting, a little bit of drawing, which I did. It wasn't that I was very serious about being a painter, but having come to Bombay, I met a large number of painters at the time. The people who were part of the whole Bombay group, like Ara and a whole lot of them, particularly in the late 50s, early 60s, Mohan Saman, quite a number of them.
M.F. Hussain?
Yeah, at that time, who were doing a wonderful work in Bombay. And so there was a certain amount of influence there. And so I took to painting. Because it was I had my cousin Lalita Lajmi, Guru's younger sister.
Uh-huh.
Now she was a painter. She continues to be a painter.
Uh-huh.
She was a painter, and because she was a painter, and then I used to play around with her brushes and so on and so forth.
Uh-huh.
Then there was Palshikar, who was he was Dean of Art at the JJ School of Art. Now Palshikar was a very encouraging kind of person.
Uh-huh.
He encouraged a lot, and he was very interested, and he would always make very useful suggestions.
Uh-huh.
Eventually, of course, we just became friends because I became a filmmaker.
Right.
But the fact that he was there, and there were people like that.
Right.
So the Jahangir Art Gallery became a kind of area of where one would meet and have cups of tea and look at work of different artists and so on and so forth. So it became a very, and then there were, opposite that, in one of those old buildings, there was the Artist Aid Center.
Right.
And that Artist Aid Center was where people like Ara used to hang about. So that was another thing. So that whole period, particularly of the 60s, I would think, was one that was very rich in what was happening in the city of Mumbai.
Right. So, what were the different genres of art, like Impressionism, Expressionism, Surrealism? There was a modern era that had already occurred in France back in the 20s with Picasso and Matisse and so forth. So, the progression from Impressionism to Expressionism to Fauvism and then later to modern abstract work of Picasso and Cubism. Did that influence you, and what particular...
Well, the history of art interested me enormously. History of particularly Western art, because you're going back actually to the Greeks and, from then on, the idea of the human form and so on, which which was given a certain kind of character and ideal, which the Greeks did, and then later on Romans and so on and so forth. But the history of art, particularly of Western art, was very much, Renaissance period. From the period of Renaissance and post-Renaissance became very, very useful because, one learned a lot about light, about lighting. Because one of the things that the post-Renaissance, Renaissance and post-Renaissance artists concentrated greatly was on what we call chiaroscuro.
Right.
The light and shade. And because the attempt was always to get the kind of three-dimensional quality that light, falling on something creates. The different depths of shade and the brightness of light, all of that, which actually gives you the three-dimensional feel of the actual object.
The influence is also seen in the noir lighting, the noir effects, fog effects, the lighting effects of V.K. Murthy that he pioneered with Gurudat, which were influenced by the German expressionist cinema of Fritz Lang and Murnau and others. Did that have an influence on you, Piazza and all those great films?
Well, it did. It did, in the sense that, I liked Murthy's style of lighting. In fact, Murthy did a lot of work with me as well. In fact, I used to like his work very much because, one of the things that Murthy brought into film was something that, for instance, the idea of darkness.
Right.
To have this kind of darkness or night.
Right.
Or of the shade, where there's this strong contrast between light and shade. Now, that kind of thing, which Murthy was absolutely outstanding with.
Right.
He was a master of that kind of lighting, contrasts, and the use of contrast, and then later looking into different shades of light, because V.K. Murthy was a person who was who had done deep study of black and white photography. For me, as a black and white cameraman, nobody was as good as V.K. Murthy in his style. He had his style of lighting fitted that perfectly. Now, if you look, for instance, one of the films that I always think was absolutely marvelously photographed was Kagaz Ke Phool, which was originally shot in black and white. There were a couple of color reels in it, but basically black and white film. And that entire studio sequence where the lights come on and so on, it's brilliant. I mean, even after so many years, it still has the power to move you. This is very unusual. And V.K. Murthy, of course, in that sense, I've always felt that he probably, as a black and white cameraman, was the best in our part of the world. The best in the other part of the world, that is the eastern part, was Subrata Mitra.
Right.
I would say that Satyajit Ray himself was a great influence. He was a great influence because one of the things that I remember most and was the way when I saw his film Pather Panchali, I had never experienced film in that particular fashion. I had never known photography to make everything so real. Now, Subrato's style, which went very well with Satyajit Ray's style, was actually a development from the work done by Jean Renoir's nephew.
Uh-huh.
See, Jean Renoir had come to India to make a film called The River.
The River.
And when he had come here, at that time, Subrata Mitra was apprenticing with Jean Renoir's cameraman. And so the styling, the lights, the way light was used in the film it had a great amount of influence on Subrata Mitra. Because Subrata otherwise was like everybody else. You know, the kind of studio lighting that was very popular at that time in our country.
Right.
And that was the regular style of making a film. Everything looked very strange and nothing looked absolutely real. And, you know, so there was always the illusion of an illusion of reality that's not even a proper illusion of reality.
Right.
You know, so when Renoir came to shoot the film River, Subrata was working with was assisting or maybe observing, I don't know. But he was there and it was his and Ray who was watching Renoir shoot his film. Ray himself was much taken by it.
Right.
And because Subrata Mitra certainly. So when Subrata actually shot Pather Panchali, you could suddenly see a sea change
Right.
in the style in which films were being shot. Total sea change. Didn't look like any other Indian film that had been shot until then.
Right. Right.
It was completely new. And that had tremendous impression on a lot of people, including me.
Right.
I was hugely impressed with that
Right.
work.
Right.
You know, first of all, there was no makeup on actors. It was, you know, everything looked so real and so believable, you know. And the art direction was so wonderful. That Bansi Chandra Gupta's work, for instance, I'd never seen work like that.
Right.
The sets didn't look like sets. They looked like they were real places.
Right.
Now, so that threesome, Satyajit Ray, Bansi Chandra Gupta and Subrata Mitra,
Right.
they absolutely revolutionized Indian cinema
Right.
in many ways.
And then you took the leaf from there and then went your way with the FFC and FBC.
Of course, and certainly Subrata Mitra and Bansi Chandra Gupta, we worked together.
Right.
You know, I got them to work with me as well later because I was so impressed with their work. And it was also a recommendation from Ray himself. You see, because he had them with him, and then of course I used to see him as not just a senior colleague, but as a person who I learnt a great deal from, Satyajit Ray. And having met him, and whenever I went to Calcutta, I used to meet him, and I used to, you know, have long chats with him. Or rather, he would talk to me. He was perfectly happy talking to me. Otherwise, he was considered to be extremely reserved, and people in Calcutta thought that he was a bit snooty, but that's not really true because he was extremely. He was a bit reserved, but he was a very giving person. You could learn a great deal from him.
Right.
And so I learned a great deal from him.
Right. Most of your films, that early films, as you learn from him, the details that you extract from Ankur, the Police Patel characters, the characters seem to grow organically from the locations. So most of your films were shot on actual locations.
You see, even Ray was not shooting all his films on real locations. It was, except for a few, even Pather Panchali, there was many of the sequences were shot in about sets. But when I was making a film, and I found that it was very expensive to do that, because hiring a studio and then having all of that was going to be pretty expensive, which I couldn't have afforded. So I was making films on real locations, and my own training as a documentary filmmaker was very helpful to me. Because if I hadn't made documentaries, I would never have learned how to
economize.
Yeah, and also how to use real locations,
Right.
Which I did. And I also had wonderful help in that sense from my cameraman,
Right.
Govind, because who also is, was very experimental, experiment-minded,
Right.
and very interested in trying out new things and new ways of doing things and so on. So all of that, I think, eventually helped me be the filmmaker I became.
Right. Govind Nilani, your DOP, was also a student of Murthy. And so, are there any particular films, early films in particular, Manthan and Bhumika, where these light effects were used pronouncedly?
Well, yes, we did. In fact, if you look at some of my films, particularly the films like Bhumika, where we did a lot of experimentation of different kinds, because you see that was also it was necessitated by because of the need. You see what happened that time was, you see we had a huge problem with foreign exchange. So a lot of the Eastman Kodak, which we had to deal with and buy with dollars.
Right.
There were no dollars. There was a huge crisis at that time.
Right.
Financial crisis in the country.
Right.
Which meant that a lot of things that you had to buy with dollars, you had to buy with rupees or on system of barter. Now, that meant that we could only deal with a few people. So you could deal with East Germany, because East Germany was part of the Soviet bloc.
Right.
So East Germany, which meant that you had to use color film, which was known as Orwo.
Right.
Now, Orwo did not have the either the quality or the ability to create the kind of color that you could do through Eastman or Technicolor.
Right.
So you had to then adapt yourself to make use of Orwo in a way that would not make it look unnatural.
Right.
Now, those are some of the things that we were constantly trying at that time. Trying to get it as well as possible. And during that process, I decided that I would interpret films also through texture and color.
Right.
And giving it different periods. For instance, when I made Bhumika, it's the story of this actress.
Hansa Vadkar.
Yeah, Hansa Vadkar, well, loosely based on her life. About this girl, her childhood is seen in sepia. Then as she grows up, it becomes black and white. From black and white, it goes into, when she becomes an actress, it goes into Orwo. From Orwo, it eventually ends up in Eastman and Technicolor. So there is a certain process of evolution, which is very much like the evolution of film itself.
Right.
From black and white, sepia, and so on and so forth all the way. So I use that device to shoot different periods, because you see the story of Bhumika was told backwards, forwards, different ways.
Right.
I was not using
Linear.
in a chronological way.
Right.
I wasn't using time in a chronological way.
Right.
I was going backwards and forwards.
Right.
And in order that the backwards and forwards would not confuse people.
Right.
So different periods were given different
Colours.
textures and colors.
Right.
So that was the whole point of it. And during that time, I had there was shortage of Eastman color. Original plan was to shoot this film in Eastman color,
I see.
but there was a shortage of it. And therefore I thought of this device
Right.
on account of that. So it was the necessity of the moment, really.
The mother of
That
invention.
I had to, so I had to decide to do it in another way.
Right.
In some ways, I'm very happy that I did it like this because it makes a lot of sense. Although at that time, when I was making it, people around me were getting very worried that I might confuse the audience. But no such thing happened because the film itself was.
Bhumika reminds me, Dev Anand and Gurudutt were the best of friends. And as chief assistant of Dev Saab, I have tried to keep their memories alive through my books and movie projects. As someone who knew both of them, did you ever think of making a film with them together?
They were very good friends, Dev Anand and he, and both were wanting to make a career in films at that time, and both were in Pravat. And then, of course, whoever got the first chance, they told each other which how much of this is true or apocryphal, I don't know.
Right.
But yes, whatever the word is.
Right.
Apocryphal, yeah.
Right.
So there is the fact that Devanand said, if I get the first opportunity to act, then you will be the director. And Gurudutt said the same thing to Devanand. In this case, of course, Devanand was the person who was
Became a big star.
And he became the actor, and then Gurudutt became the director. And that's how they made their careers together.
What is your earliest memory of meeting Dev Saab and Gurudutt together?
Well, I don't have too much of a memory of that because by the time I was in Bombay, Devanand and Gurudutt were not working together. They were working separately. And so I didn't have, I did meet, but I would meet them for different reasons. For instance, I think Geeta, there was a wedding anniversary, Gurudutt's wedding anniversary once, where I met Devanand for the first time, as a grown-up. And a couple of places like that. But I don't have it. My memory is very. It's kind of. His life was cut short,
What a tragedy.
Because there was a lot more to him than what we actually saw.
Right. He was on the threshold of great things.
Yeah, he had a great deal to him. Except that, he had unfortunately become an alcoholic to some extent. And that came in the way.
Actually, did you come across any undiscovered scripts that he left behind that his brothers?
There were a couple, he did have a couple of scripts. There was one that he had given to me, asking me if I would like to make a film of it for him. Meaning he would be the producer and I would be the director.
Really?
Yeah, but it didn't happen. It didn't happen because I didn't particularly care for that story, and he had lost interest in it.
What was the name of it?
It was a film with Wahida in it. Wahida just come at that time, and something that he was very keen. But he felt that he couldn't. It wasn't his kind of subject.
In today's advertising age of paid news and fake news, do we really need films to sell dreams instead of reality?
In many ways, wanting to be a filmmaker is like wanting to climb Mount Everest. It's not an easy thing. You see, because you have to go through a whole process. Like you have to be assisting somebody or so many things, because it costs a lot of money to make a film. And people are not going to trust you with money unless they're sure that you'll turn out a product which will not be a loss for them. So naturally it's not easy. So what's the next best way of getting into filmmaking? In my case, it was advertising. Because in advertising, there were certain advertising agencies like Lintas, for instance, which was connected to Hindustan Lever. Now, Hindustan Lever used to produce a large number of consumer products. And for advertising those, they used a lot of print media and so on and so forth, but they also used cinema as a medium. They used advertising films to publicize and to promote their products. And therefore Lintas, which used to be the advertising agency for Hindustan Lever, they had a proper film department. And because they used to make a large number of films. At that time, they used to make up to 600, 700 versions of about 50 or 60 films in different Indian languages. So there was a lot of film work there. And so when I found that this was the case with Lintas, I had come here to join an advertising agency hoping for, but here suddenly was my dream come true.
What advice would you give to all the artists and filmmakers waiting to follow in your illustrious footsteps?
I have no advice to give to anybody. They must find their own way, as people do. Giving advice to people is totally useless. It's a question of people, they must be motivated. If somebody is motivated to do the kind of thing they want to do it, they will do it. All you can do is to encourage them. But beyond that, I don't think there is any advice to be given. Advice means you know and they don't know, which is not true.
Right.
They know as much as you do.
Right.
If you found your way, they will find theirs. I have no advice.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.